Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my old reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Golden Axe, originally released in arcades but later re-released on numerous different systems, although the version you're seeing here is the Sega Genesis version, being played through the Sega Genesis Classics collection on Steam. This is a side-scrolling beat-em-up developed and published by Sega that was first released in arcades in 1989, and later on in that same year it saw a release on Sega Genesis, and the following year it would see a release on the Mega Drive in Europe. Since then, the game has been re-released in numerous compilations on numerous systems over the years, from PC to more modern consoles, really you name it. There was even a 3D supposedly enhanced remake of the game made for the PS2, and I might cover that in a different video, but right now we're just going to focus on the Genesis version of the game, which upon its launch was very well received, and it spawned 2 additional sequels as well as even a fighting game spin-off called Golden Axe The Duel. And eventually they would come out with Golden Axe Beast Rider, trying to resurrect the series to some degree, but that didn't really go as planned. But we'll get to that one eventually as well. For now, let's go ahead and delve into this game and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, and how it adapts the arcade original to the Sega Genesis platform. Well, considering the hardware limitations of the Sega Genesis compared to the original arcade version, they've actually done a very good job of porting the visuals over. The sprite work is generally rather solid, and they have some pretty decent animations going on, although they are fairly low in the actual sprite count, meaning that occasionally the animations can look a bit jerky. There are also moments where you can compare the visuals of the Genesis version to the original arcade version, and you find that they're not as detailed in the environments, for example. And one thing you probably will notice if you've played the arcade original and you go to this one is that it's considerably less graphic in its violence. Now, that's not to say that the arcade original was a gore fest or anything, it certainly wasn't, but it did have some blood in it, and that's been removed entirely from the Sega Genesis version. Really, it's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things, but if you are comparing the arcade original to the Sega Genesis version, it is worth mentioning. Similarly worth mentioning are the changes in the sound department. Now, they did their best to try to port the music over to the slightly weaker Sega Genesis sound chip, but they hadn't really mastered the sound chip yet, so the translation of the music ends up being generally fairly accurate, but at times a bit slower and a bit weaker. The sound effects are similarly affected because they have less of them in the Genesis version than they did in the original arcade version, and also considering the limitations of the hardware, they're of a lower definition, meaning that, for example, the screams are less intense, the attack sounds are considerably goofier, and it doesn't work quite as well. But when you bring it all together, what you have is a fairly faithful adaptation of the arcade original, at least as far as visuals and sound goes, when you keep in mind the limitations of the Genesis hardware compared to the more powerful hardware they had on the original arcade release. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although the story takes a massive backseat to the gameplay in a beat-em-up like this. The story is not much more than a basic setup for why you're doing what you're doing, and the characters are basically non-existent other than, well, this is what they look like and this is what their abilities are. You play as one of 3 characters that you choose at the beginning of the game. Either you're a barbarian wielding a 2-handed sword named Axe Battler, you're a dwarf wielding a battle axe named Julius Thunderhead, or you are an Amazon wielding a sword named Tyrus Flare. But regardless of who you pick, the setup for the story is the same. The king and the princess have been captured by this evildoer named Death Adder, who is holding them captive in the castle, and is basically trying to rule the world. Each of the player characters has lost someone dear to them, and thus sets out on a campaign of vengeance against Death Adder, and in so doing, they fight their way through his minions and generals, eventually culminating in a showdown with Death Adder himself, in which case they are supposed to defeat him and rescue the king and princess. The thing is, while that's where the arcade version ends, the console version actually does not end there. It's like, wait a minute, there was somebody pulling the strings behind Death Adder. So you keep going and you go through another stage and end up fighting another boss fight. Now, you may be concerned that I've just spoiled the entire game's plot for you, but that really doesn't matter. This is a beat-em-up game and there's barely any story in this to begin with. Beyond the stage transitions where it basically goes, okay, so we went to this location and now we're going to this location. There's really only the opening text crawl that's basically like, okay, Death Adder is doing horrible things and he killed your friend Alex, among other things, go save the world. And the ending dialogues, which are basically like, congratulations, you have saved the world from Death Adder. So there's really nothing there as far as plot goes, and what you end up falling back on is the gameplay itself, which is a fairly standard beat-em-up game from that particular time period. While each character does have their own strengths and weaknesses, your controls for all of them are going to be the same. You move around with the D-pad, and you have 3 buttons that you use to interact with the game itself. These are the A button for magic, B button for attack, and C button for jumping. And of course there are combinations you can do with the jump and attack buttons in order to achieve different results. If you press the jump button and then the attack button after that, you will do a jumping attack. If you press both of them at the same time, then you will actually do a spinning attack behind you. And if you are doing a dash and then you do a jump and then an attack and hold the button down, then you actually will do this more powerful attack where you jump up very high into the air and then attack downwards. It's rather tricky to land that, however, so you probably won't rely on it too much. What you will be relying on an awful lot, though, is the dash attack, where if you double tap the D-pad in one direction or another, you'll start running, and then you can press the attack button to ram into enemies and knock them over. Beyond that, there are your basic combos, which are actually dependent on how far away you are from the enemy when you're attacking them. So for example, if you're close enough, then you'll actually just grab them and throw them, as opposed to doing the full combo, which is 2 hits followed by 2 pommel strikes followed by kicking them away. Meanwhile, if you're a bit too far away from the enemy, then you'll just do a 3-hit combo instead, which knocks them back. The thing is that the controls are a bit tricky for that, because you'll be pressing the button and you have to keep pressing the button every single time you want to attack, but it doesn't seem to register the inputs all that well. Now you may be going, oh, but DW, that's because you're playing this on an emulated version. It's actually not. I actually have the game on my actual Sega Genesis, and I have played the living crap out of it, and it's the same way on that too. In fact, the main solution I had on the original Sega Genesis version was to use the turbo function on my controller, which allowed me to just hold the attack button down and then do the full combo in quick order. But then that had other unintended consequences on the other controls, so it ended up actually making the game more difficult in the long run, but that's beside the point. Main point there is that the attack controls are a bit finicky, so you do have to get used to the way they work, and even when you do get used to them, they're still going to be fighting you the whole time. Now, it is worth noting as well that this was less of an issue in the sequels. They do register your inputs a bit better in those. But at least as far as the original Golden Axe goes, it is a bit of a problem. Now, beyond the jumping and attacking and the various combinations thereof, you also have the magic button, which is just a single-use thing. This is tied in with the magic meter system. Now, you'll encounter these thieves throughout the game. They're the little guys running around in blue and green, and the green ones just drop food that instantly heals you for a bar of health, but the blue thieves actually drop magic potions that will fill up your magic meter. Now, each character has a different level of magic meter that they can attain. For example, Julius only has 3 levels of magic, which basically accounts for 4 magic potions. This is because he's designed as a primarily combat character, where he has the longest reach out of all of the player characters as far as his attacks go, but at the cost of having considerably weaker magic potential. Axe Battler is the more middle-of-the-road one, and Tyrus Flare is the weakest in terms of actual combat ability, but she has the most potent magic. So depending on who you're playing, it might be very quickly that you can build up your magic meter to the max, or it might take quite a while because you have to actually save it between the stages in order to actually get the max level of your magic meter. Now here's the thing about magic. Most of the time you're going to save it for when you actually need it, which is the boss fights, where bosses can be kind of cheap, and they also have quite a lot of health, which means that that very powerful magic comes in handy. But of course you can use it in a pinch if you're surrounded by enemies and you're taking an awful lot of damage to instantly either annihilate all of the enemies on the screen, or at least do quite a bit of damage to them. Obviously, the higher level of magic on your meter, the more damage it's going to do, so that is something to keep in mind. If you're only at level 1 magic, it's not going to do a whole lot, whereas if you're maxed out, then it's probably going to do a screen wipe. Or at the very least, it'll come close to doing a screen wipe. But here's the thing, again, you have to save up your magic to get to that level, and with Tyrus in particular, that actually takes quite a while, so it's a resource that you do have to manage effectively. This is made slightly more annoying by the fact that in between each stage you have a section where the character is sitting there at camp, and a thief runs in and steals 2 of the magic potions. Of course, the idea there is to be able to get additional magic potions, because not only can you knock them around and get the 2 that they steal from you, but you can also keep knocking them around to get more potions. But it is still a bit annoying because they run around considerably faster than you do, and as a result, it can be a bit tricky to get them sometimes. It is something you can kind of get the hang of, however, so it never really becomes that much of a problem. What may be a bit more of an issue for you, however, is that the game is actually rather short and there's not a huge amount of content in it. A single playthrough is about half an hour long. There are only 3 basic enemy types. Those are the club wielders, the mace wielders, and the skeletons, and the way they differentiate between the various power levels of them is what color palette they're using, so that's a bit bland. And then there are only 3 different types of boss enemies, which are the hammer wielders, the sword and shield wielders, and of course the axe wielder, which is Death Adder. I guess you could technically count the final boss as well, but he's just a palette swap of Death Adder with slightly more abilities, which are incredibly cheap, I might add, because he can knock you down and then follow that up immediately with an unblockable, undodgeable magic attack that instantly takes away another bar of health. In fact, the bosses in general are just kind of cheap, especially the sword wielders, because they have a very, very long range attack that is well out of range of what you can actually hit them at, so what you end up having to do is basically cheese the AI by just constantly doing the ramming attack. In fact, that's something you generally do throughout the vast majority of the game because the enemies are going to be doing it to you anyway, so you might as well get the drop on them instead, and most of the time it's actually more effective than doing anything else. They do have 3 different types of mounts that you can get in the game. One of them is a fire-breathing dragon that shoots out a breath of flame, one of them spits a fireball, and then another one is a more lizard-like creature that swings its tail around. Of those, the one that spits the fireballs is the best one, but unfortunately it's also the rarest unless you're playing 2-player, in which case they're actually relatively common. And speaking of 2-player, I unfortunately cannot show you that in this because of the manner in which the footage was recorded, but suffice to say, it's just playing through the exact same game with more enemies and you're playing it with an additional player. And you do have to be careful when you're attacking enemies because the fellow player can actually get damaged by your attacks as well. Of course, this does not extend to your magic attacks, only your melee attacks. But really, that's it. 3 basic enemy types, 3 boss types, an additional 2-player mode, 3 different types of mounts, and in the console home release, they also have a mode called The Duel, which is basically just a survival mode where you pick one of the 3-player characters, you're given a large health bar, and you go up against wave after wave of enemies, and you have to beat them within the time limit, as well as on that single bar of health. You can, of course, also play that in 2-player mode, where it's actually a player versus player kind of deal, so it ends up being something of a really crappy fighting game when that happens. But really, when you get down to it, there's not a whole lot of content on offer here, and the sequels were just better games, frankly. That's not to say that Golden Axe 1 is a bad game, it's certainly not, and it's a pretty decent adaptation of the arcade original, but you have to overlook the fairly low amount of content and the somewhat tricky controls in order to actually get to any of the good stuff. And what you ultimately have on offer here is a game that I can really only recommend to fans of beat-em-ups to begin with. If you're new to the genre, I'd recommend more the likes of Streets of Rage, which is a lot easier to pick up and play and has much more responsive controls, but if you are a fan of beat-em-up games, then you'll almost certainly enjoy the original Golden Axe. Just know that it can be a bit of a frustrating mess sometimes. I'll have a link in the video description box to where you can pick this up if you're interested. Thanks for watching.